Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, September 28th, 2020. We have a fresh round of wildfires plaguing Northern California near some of my friends' homes in St. Helena at the north end of the Napa Valley. Broke out Sunday morning about 4 a.m. and they're spreading fast. Lots of people evacuating. Well, Donald Trump got a big surprise from the New York Times because there's so many different efforts. The Manhattan District Attorney, the House Ways and Means Committee, lots of people have been trying to get a hold of Trump's tax records. The New York Times isn't saying how they got them, but they say that they are legit and that they didn't break any laws to acquire them. And it is fairly stunning, even though most of us have suspected for a long time that Trump has grossly inflated his wealth. He's a fraud. He's a fraud as a billionaire, and he is a tax cheat who practices tax fraud as a way of life. And the stunning numbers that in 2016 he paid $750 in federal income taxes, and he paid the same amount, $750, in 2017. We can all relate to that because we have an idea of how much tax we paid last year. I'm self-employed, so I file these quarterly payments, and I have never paid $750 even for a quarterly payment. And I don't claim to be a guy with a millionaire's income. Now, what is most remarkable is the silence of all Republicans. The New York Times quizzed all of them for comment. Nobody had nothing to say. They had to go all the way to John Kasich, the former governor of Ohio, a Republican turncoat who spoke at the Democratic convention. Remember, he stood at the crossroads someplace in Ohio. He said, average folks are scraping to make a living. They're going to wake up to find out this incredible mogul paid $750. I don't care what his excuses are, Kasich said. It doesn't pass the smell test. It's not going to disrupt those people who were for him totally. They'll still be for him. But it's those people on the fence. And Trump rejected it as totally fake news. And then he kind of changed his tune Monday morning in a series of tweets. He didn't explicitly deny the claim that he paid only $750 in federal income taxes in 16 and 17. Instead, he lashed out at the suggestion that he's not as wealthy and successful as he has claimed. He said, if you look at the extraordinary assets owned by me, which the fake news hasn't, I'm extremely under-leveraged. I have very little debt compared to the value of assets. But because Michael Cohen disclosed in his congressional testimony last year and in his book published this year that Trump routinely inflated his assets and income when he went to borrow money from banks or impress a possible business partner. But he had a second set of books that were cooked down to a reduction sauce to make it look like he didn't owe any taxes. And fundamentally, he can't have it both ways. And that's what he is trying to do. He wants to, it's not a straddle, because he's trying to maintain two possibilities, only one of which can be true. Now, here's one place where I criticize the Times for lack of context. Their report says he's personally responsible for loans and other debts totaling $421 million, with most of it coming due within 4 years. Should he win re-election, his lenders could be placed in the unprecedented position of weighing whether to foreclose on a sitting president. Now, what's missing here is that we don't know on any of his given properties how much equity he has. And can he cash that out? Could he sell one golf property and refinance the rest? Well, as I was starting to say, he's a bad risk for lenders now because they know he's a con man and a fraud. And so he would need some sort of a friendly banker. And Deutsche Bank was the last one willing to loan him money. So when you dig into the numbers, and the New York Times flooded us with a lot of data. The initial article runs 62 pages. The one that kind of lays out graphically the timeline of some of his investments. It's a lot to absorb, and it's one of the reasons that I am recording the podcast about an hour late today, because I was away over the weekend and took some time to digest all this. So let me give you some of the key elements of the New York Times report. They looked at the last 18 years, where Trump paid no federal income taxes in 11 of those 18 years. And he had the last 2 years that they have seen, 16 and 17, where he claimed his tax bill was only $750. He has reduced his tax bill with questionable measures, including a $73 million tax refund that is the subject of an audit by the Internal Revenue Service. And Trump keeps saying that that's the reason he can't release his returns because, as soon as this audit is wrapped up, and I plan to make sure that never happens, I'll release my tax returns. Next finding, many of his signature businesses, including his golf courses, report losing large amounts of money, losses that have helped him to reduce his taxes. The financial pressure on him is increasing as hundreds of millions of dollars in loans that he personally guaranteed are coming due in the near future. Even while declaring losses, he's managed to enjoy a lavish lifestyle by taking tax deductions on what most people would consider personal expenses, including residences, aircraft, and $70,000 for that thing that rides on top of his head. And Michael Cohen says that Trump cuts his own hair. I didn't realize that. But I do have to say that this is another thing that's kind of taken out of context, because Trump reported direct income from NBC of somewhere in the neighborhood of $240 million. He cut a deal, because he's the best deal cutter of all time, where he got half of the profits from that awful reality show, The Apprentice. And it did make money for NBC, and a $70,000 write-off for the mop top against $240 million. I know you and I wouldn't attempt to do that, but it's not completely out of bounds. But we also learned that Ivanka has written off, through the Trump Organization, $95,000 in hairstyling expenses. Now, she's not a TV star, not really a public figure. And while she has the best hair, and her incestuously loving father would be happy to point that out, I can't see a basis for her making a legitimate deduction for hair care. Also, Ivanka was paid consulting fees at the same time she was an employee of the Trump Organization, which, in addition to being double dipping, seems to be at least an opportunist approach to, creating phony tax write-offs. But it also implicates her in any criminal behavior that is found in the tax dodging, tax cheating of Trump, his organization, which, of course, involves all of his kids. As president, Trump has received more money from foreign sources and U.S. interest groups than previously known, and the Times is very disappointed to report the records do not reveal any previously unreported connections to Russia. So, one of the big questions that arises here is the extent to which Trump has benefited from the 2017 tax cut bill that he signed into law. Now, we know that one place where he didn't end up saving money or reducing his taxes was the cap on state and local tax write-offs. But it's believed that he benefited massively from restructuring of depreciation caps. And that allows somebody who owns property to write down the decreasing value of it over time. And the enhancements in the 2017 mostly corporate tax cut bill do appear to have benefited him bigly, as he would say. And that tax refund, $73 million, appears to be what is fundamentally at stake in this IRS audit that's been running for some 9 years now with no end in sight. And, of course, we knew from previous revelations that he lost massive amounts of money, $1 billion or more, with his bad casino investments in Atlantic City. And he was able to use the loss carry forward to zero out his taxes for much of the next 20 years. Then he had this big spike in income from NBC and from various licensing deals, promotional stunts, endorsement deals, where he doubled the 240 to somewhere around 420 million. But then he sunk that into golf courses, which are money pits, and not just the sand traps. So he is a guy who plays it to the hilt. He has said in the past that he's the king of debt. And I know from doing my own taxes over the years how when you increase your write-offs, you reduce your taxable income and ultimately the tax bill that you have to pay. And Trump seems to be so brazen about it. The things where you and I might round up our deduction for auto expenses or, something like that. We might declare some entertainment expense like a meal or beverage tab. Claim it was business when, maybe we talked about business. Those are all very subjective issues, but they're modest amounts of money. And Trump, who does appear to be cash-strapped, helps explain why he didn't actually fund his own campaign in 2016, and despite the crunch he's in now, hasn't put a dime, we know of, into the 2020 race. He appears to be cash poor. This explains his desperate need to remain as president at all costs, partly to run out the clock and the statute of limitations on crimes of the past, but partly because the money that people pay to grease him at the Trump Hotel in Washington, at his golf properties. There was one group that spent, I think, a couple of $1 million at the Doral in Miami, and then got some special treatment, special consideration from the Trumpster. So it's quite a story. And I invite you to read more in the New York Times. There's loads of detail that I won't try to pass along to you. Oh, let me pass along one other detail. And it relates to the golf courses in Scotland and Ireland, where he has been losing large amounts of money. And that can explain why he asked his ambassador to Britain, Woody Johnson, to put the squeeze on the Brits to bring the British Open to his golf course in Scotland. It's why he didn't recuse or set up a trust to put his holdings in, left the kids in charge. We know he is very much involved, or at least well aware of what is going on in the company, even though he says that he's not directly managing it. And I doubt that there's a direct connection here. In fact, the citation I'm about to offer may be moot, as they say in legal lingo, but judges on a federal appeals court on Friday expressed skepticism about Trump's arguments that a subpoena from the Manhattan District Attorney seeking 8 years of tax returns was overbroad and issued in bad faith. The 3 judges on the panel challenged a central argument from Trump and his lawyers. They said the demand was a politically motivated fishing expedition. The judges said, well, how is it a fishing expedition if a taxpayer's returns cover operations nationwide, worldwide, outside of Manhattan Island? And when the attorney Consovoy was asked whether there was any request for the president's records that he would consider not overly broad, I think the answer is probably no, Your Honor. And the judge said, that's a problem. So David Sirota, who a couple of years back did some investigation in how Senator Corker, Bob Corker of Tennessee, the one who said you don't want to poke the bear, referring to Trump, he colluded with Trump, and Corker is a real estate investor himself. And not in the House version, not in the Senate version of the 2017 tax bill, but in the conference hearings where they try to reconcile the differences between the 2 versions of a bill, that's where the issue related to depreciation in real estate deals was inserted. The language would specifically allow owners of large real estate holdings through limited liability companies to deduct a percentage of their pass-through income from their taxes. Now, you and I don't even understand all the details of that because we don't qualify for those kinds of tax breaks. And Sirota got a report from the Congressional Budget Office reporting that in 2011 through 2013, $381 billion worth of taxes went unpaid each year, and $266 billion of that was related to the top 1%. So whether you do it with an accountant or whether what appears Trump did, which was just to put phony numbers in there and say, so sue me. The upper class in this country, the uber wealthy, are not content to accept the tax breaks that they already had and the use of trusts and offshore companies and shell companies. No, the greed knows no bounds. And that is part of the glue that holds Trump's base together. So I do not dance when people develop personal psychiatric issues. But it's not hard to have an inner giggle when we learn that Sunday morning in Fort Lauderdale, Brad Parscale, the demoted former campaign manager of the Trump 2020 operation, got involved in an armed standoff with police. He was reported to be drunk and suicidal. His wife, Candace, said that they'd had an altercation. Basically, he was out of control. So she called 911. They dispatched officers to the Parscale home. And he grabbed a gun and was pacing and ranting inside the house as they tried to calm him by telephone. And Candace reported that she heard a gunshot, or was it a car backfiring? She said he's been stressed out and has made comments about shooting himself. She said he drinks a lot, suffers from PTSD. The first cop who arrived got him on the phone and said Mr. Parscale's speech was slurred as though he was under the influence of an alcoholic beverage, and he seemed to be crying. Now, this is 6'8", Brad Parscale, the digital evil genius who ran the Trump campaign and who could use these really hateful messages that were super targeted at groups of people. We'll give you an example here in a moment. But the confrontation was resolved when the Fort Lauderdale police summoned Christopher Wilson, one of their officers, who describes himself as a personal friend of Parscale. When he got on the phone, Parscale agreed to exit the house. It looks like his friend Wilson kind of double-crossed him, because as soon as Parscale came out just wearing a pair of shorts, we don't know if, like Jerry Falwell Jr., they were partly unzipped. But anyway, Parscale was ordered to get on the ground. He didn't, so an officer used a double-leg takedown to tackle him. Then he was involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation under Florida's Baker Act that allows authorities to detain a person for up to 72 hours. So Parscale was demoted, and some people think he was fired after that rally, the mob rally in Tulsa back in June, where Parscale said that as many as 1 million people requested tickets and 100,000 would show up, but only 6,000 did. And the online disruptor himself was the target of a ruse. And a group of young activists ordered up phony tickets to the event. And they beat him at his own game. And maybe that's why wife Candace said he's suffering from PTSD. He was probably on the receiving end of speakerphone rants from the Donald. So this has just surfaced from 2016. One of Parscale's brainstorms was an attempt to deter 3.5 million black Americans in battleground states from voting by deliberately targeting them with negative Hillary Clinton ads on Facebook. And this was the dark targeting using the Cambridge Analytica data that I believe was much more effective and much more damaging than anything that Russia attempted to do to meddle in our election in 2016. According to the investigation, the Trump campaign's goal was to dissuade African Americans from backing Hillary entirely by targeting them with dark adverts, as The Guardian puts it, on their Facebook feeds, which heavily attacked Clinton and in some cases argued she lacked sympathy with black Americans. So Trump has dismissed the whole tax document report by the New York Times as fake news. And our friends over at the Gray Zone Project, and Ben Norton in particular, have lowered the boom on the New York Times because in a very popular podcast called Caliphate, which is hosted by one of the Times' celebrated reporters, Rukmini Callimachi, the Caliphate podcast claims to tell the story of the rise and fall of the Islamic State. And it's largely based on the testimony, if you will, of a man who used the name Abu Huzaifa al-Kanadi. And al-Kanadi means the Canadian in Arabic. His real name is Shiroz Chowdhury. He was arrested last week by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, facing up to 5 years in prison for faking his role as an alleged member of ISIS. He claimed to have killed people, including some of the grisly beheadings that were shot on video and circulated around the globe. And the New York Times has been caught pretty much red-handed, promoting what Trump would call fake news. And Norton quotes from one episode of the podcast, episode 6, in the voice of Rukmini. Look, it makes sense to me that somebody has been in that caliphate, that if he's trying to exaggerate a little, oh, yeah, I was there when Baghdadi, announced this or that, whatever. That makes sense to me. But not going there at all and making up all of those details about the Abu Nimr tribesmen, about this execution, about what it's like to hold the gun, about what it's like to actually whip somebody. It's too much. I mean, he's providing details that nobody knows, So, according to this report, out of 10 or 11 episodes, 9 of them featured this guy whose real name is Chowdhury. And the New York Times is playing down the report of these discrepancies. And this is more than a discrepancy. I mean, this is, it's as much of a coup, if you will, against the Times as the coup against Brad Parscale and claiming that, there are going to be 1 million people trying to attend the Trump mob rally the day after Juneteenth in Tulsa. And it is this kind of reporting that gives Trump at least a little leg to stand on when he routinely says fake news to everything he doesn't want to hear. And at the rival Washington Post, Eric Wemple, who is a good media critic, he comes up a little short when it comes to criticizing his own outlet. But he wrote a lengthy expose on how the Times was suckered by this guy Chowdhury. And it goes into great detail about the contents of the podcast, lays out a timeline. And one of the critical issues exposed here is that the claim that he had killed people is contradicted by information that the same guy told a Canadian outlet, Global News, that he hadn't killed anyone. So we know he's a liar. And the presumption here is that he lied to the New York Times. Maybe he lied to the Canadian outlet. I don't know. But it is certainly damaging to the fortunes and credibility of the New York Times. And before the tax expose broke on Sunday, Trump had been tweeting, again trying to direct people to the Durham investigation of the origins of the Russiagate investigation. And if he gets traction there, it is another way of showing that the New York Times has indeed promoted fake news. And I'm still bracing for that. Let me just warn folks, we have not reached bottom. There are 41 days left until the election, and we will go lower. Consider that the first presidential debate between Biden and Trump is tomorrow night. How will Joe play these tax issues? Will he be able to land a devastating blow on Trump? As a man who cannot be trusted in any way and who cheats the American people by letting all the rest of us pay taxes while he cheats. So on Saturday, I caught part of the streaming video of Trump announcing formally the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the United States Supreme Court. And what a package she is. For the right wing, she pushes all the right buttons. She's clearly against Obamacare. She's deeply opposed to abortion in any form. She has 7 kids, including 2 black kids from Haiti and 1 who has Down syndrome. Among his other, praiseful comments, Trump said she would be the first Supreme Court justice who's raising young children. I don't consider that to be relevant in any way, but to the right-wingers, that's a bobblehead trigger. So she is a Catholic. She would be the 6th Catholic justice on the court. Sonia Sotomayor is not a conservative Catholic, but she is Catholic. Amy Coney Barrett is a highly conservative Catholic. And in her confirmation hearings to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, where she currently sits, Dianne Feinstein, lead Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, got into a discussion about Barrett and her commitment to dogma. And Feinstein cited a speech she gave to Notre Dame Law. Your legal career is but a means to an end, and that end is building the kingdom of God. And her public religiosity is something that Trump believes is going to help him win the election, and having her on the court will help him win just like George W. Bush did when the contested election of 2000 was decided by the court on a 5-4 basis. And Barrett would join Kavanaugh and Roberts as justices who are actively involved in shutting down the counting of votes in Florida and heaving George W. Bush into the Oval Office by 538 votes. And so in my San Francisco Chronicle today, the lead political reporter, Joe Garofoli, is quoting conservative Catholics, including some Catholics who are for Biden, saying that Democrats on the Judiciary Committee have to be careful. If they're viewed as attacking her religion, it could backfire and benefit Trump. And at the Saturday announcement, Trump issued a warning to Democrats in, once again, a brazen effort at projection, saying, now, don't be partisan in these hearings. This whole operation is partisan on the part of the Republicans, but we don't acknowledge that. Instead, we demonize Democrats for attempting to stall or defeat this confirmation. And I heard a lengthy clip from Senator Amy Klobuchar, who was responding to comments by Senator Ted Cruz. This was recorded on Friday. And Klobuchar did a good job of pushing back on the false claims of Republicans that the Democrats are the partisan operators here. She mostly focused on the risk to Obamacare, that millions of people during a pandemic will be left without health insurance. But so far, I hear the Democrats studiously avoiding calling out her extreme position on abortion rights. I think this is a calculation. Democrats are afraid to make too big a deal of that because they see the polls on abortion at about 50-50. They don't believe that they can pick up any new support by championing reproductive rights. And that may be true on abortion itself, but I believe that there is a broad swath of the American public that supports contraception. And Amy Coney Barrett wrote a blistering critique of John Roberts delivering the fifth vote to uphold Obamacare, and she also has publicly commented on the Hobby Lobby case and others, where she believes that corporate leaders and their companies can hold religious views, and that it's a violation of religious freedom, for example, for the Affordable Care Act to mandate free contraceptive coverage to any woman who has coverage. And they better fight. And I do understand that contraception is a safer ground than abortion. But this is where you cannot count on the Democrats to put up a full defense and actually attempt to stall or defeat this confirmation. They're going to nibble around the edges. They're going to allow Kamala Harris to grandstand. And in the end, the Republicans will steamroll this through the Senate, probably before November 3rd. So there's a lot that's been published about Amy Coney Barrett. I'm still cringing because the Republicans didn't even wait for Ruth Bader Ginsburg to be buried before she was nominated, and they immediately started selling T-shirts that refer to Amy Coney Barrett, as the notorious ACB. Now, number one, that's a form of appropriation or copycat behavior that is just so ridiculous and absurd. And what she's notorious for is being a far-right Christian with a Catholic cross hanging around her neck And she's given speeches to this Blackstone Legal Fellowship, which is part of the Alliance Defending Freedom. They consider separation of church and state to be a false concept. They're deeply opposed to same-sex marriage, to abortion. And this time, the Republicans are not using the kind of stealth approach. In the past, people like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, even going back to Alito and Roberts, they would dodge the question about whether they would overturn Roe versus Wade. But Barrett is so out there on the record that she can't deny that that's at least her personal view. And Senator Josh Hawley, hard right-winger from Missouri, he said he'll only support a nominee who explicitly acknowledges that Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided, and he said that Barrett clearly meets that threshold. So this is going to be a very different confirmation process. Because of the election that is so nearby and people are already voting, both parties are going to be pulling punches or directing punches based on how they think it's going to affect the election. And not just the presidential race, the Senate races as well. And at this point, I cannot predict how it's all going to sort out. But as I said, we haven't hit bottom yet, and this is going to be quite a wild ride to that bottom. So her public criticism of Chief Justice Roberts, who, quote, pushed the Affordable Care Act beyond its plausible meaning to save the statute, well, there is no stealth here. And that's where I hope the Democrats will find some openings to exploit. And then there is this. Amy Coney Barrett is a follower of the People of Praise, and it can only be described as a cult. The church asks members to take a lifetime loyalty covenant, encourages female submission to their husbands. Some people believe it inspired The Handmaid's Tale. The church calls itself a charismatic Christian community. We admire the first Christians who were led by the Holy Spirit to form a community. Each member of the church is allotted a personal advisor who helps them with decisions on marriage, career, and other life choices. Will they have somebody whispering into the justice's ear? Members are also asked to give out information like their sins, their financial information. And will the Democrats go there? Or will they be kind of demagogued into keeping quiet? Because you don't want to poke that religious bear either. And I don't have much confidence in the Democratic strategy, at least not what I've heard so far. And a new poll published by the New York Times today shows two things that are slightly in conflict. To the question, whom would you like to see appoint the next Supreme Court justice? 56% said the winner of the election, 41% said Trump. Asked, who do you trust to do a better job of choosing? 50% Joe Biden, 43% Trump. Now this same group that was polled said abortion should be always or mostly legal, 60%. Always or mostly illegal, only 33%. And by a wide margin, these people polled support the Affordable Care Act, 57 to 38%. But get this, while most of these voters would prefer that the next president appoint Justice Ginsburg's successor, they were effectively split on whether the Senate should now proceed with Trump's nomination. 47% said it should, 48% said it shouldn't, and 5% had no opinion. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Alice Carlson, Joey Perillo, or Perillo if you prefer, And there's Jerry and Cheeky over at Lake Como in Italy. They all support this podcast, and you can too. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, Vice News is reporting that video footage and documents depict Louisville police officers apparently violating department policies at the crime scene after Breonna Taylor had been shot and killed. Hours of the body camera footage have been analyzed now. It shows officers appearing to break multiple department policies, corroborates parts of Taylor's boyfriend's testimony. It also raises questions about the integrity of not only the crime scene, but also the investigation into what happened that night. The footage came from 45 different body cams. Crime scene photos contradict initial statements by the police department, claiming that the officers involved did not wear body cameras. Photos of officers taken from that night clearly show that at least one of the 7 officers did have a body camera over his right shoulder. Footage shows that not one of the 7 officers who were present for the raid immediately separated and paired up with an escort, which is a violation of Louisville Police Department policy. And at one point, the detectives who came to analyze the crime scene shooed away the detective Brett Hankison, who is the only one indicted for his wanton shooting that put bullets into the adjacent apartment of a white family. And after the SWAT team members cleared the apartment and pronounced Taylor dead, former Detective Hankison, who fired 10 shots that night, approaches the front door to ask if someone is dead inside. Minutes later, he returns, steps inside the apartment, and that's where he's told, move along. This is a crime scene. So this is not surprising. It explains why it took 100 days for this case to finally come before a grand jury that then put out a very weak indictment and claimed that because the boyfriend fired 1 shot, which only wounded an officer, that all the rest of the police shooting was therefore justified. On the crime patrol, an L.A. sheriff's deputy was caught on video just the other day striking a protester with his riot shield. This was on Friday. These are Breonna Taylor demonstrations in West Hollywood. This was captured on video. The department acknowledges that force was used. They said they're investigating. In the videos, a man can be seen lying on the ground surrounded by several sheriff's deputies. And this is the rogue department that continues to just conduct outrageous police behavior. And one of the deputies used the edge of his riot shield to strike the protesters' ankles several times. Now, that is no kind of approved police maneuver. And the eyewitnesses said that the group of cops surrounding the suspect had him under control. There were so many on top of him, said Cammie Hicks. What was the purpose if you guys are all holding him down? Meanwhile, in response to a lawsuit stemming from protests earlier this year in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, the LAPD released a bunch of meaningless video footage in the case of Abigail Rodas. She was on the receiving end of one of those less lethal rounds of munitions that cops use, and it did extreme damage to her eye and her jaw. But the LAPD released footage which doesn't include the incident where Rodas was hit. It shows the scene. It shows cops complaining about being hit by water bottles and other projectiles. But I consider it a meaningless smokescreen from the LAPD. And just south of L.A., Yorba Linda, where a group of anti-racist protesters were partly organized by 40-year-old Titania Turner of Long Beach, and she's now being held at the Orange County Jail, accused of attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Now, her allies say that counter-protesters, white people, converged on the protest at the Yorba Linda Library, and they surrounded her car. I saw a picture of a Prius with a shattered rear window. And this news account from the LA Times indicates the front windshield was either damaged or broken as well. And so her friends say that she did her best to get out of a life-threatening situation. And as she drove away, 2 of the white counter-protesters were injured by her car. So the claim that she deserves an attempted murder charge seems just a little bit over the top. And over at Mint-Press News today, Alan McLeod is reporting that since George Floyd was killed, there have been 104 separate incidents of drivers crashing into protests, including 96 civilians, 8 police vehicles, and that from that total of 104, 39 drivers have been charged in 43 cases. The investigator here, Ari Weil, said that I've coded the driver as having malicious intent. So it has become a thing. And speaking of Los Angeles, I want to commend the new publisher of the LA Times. In a lengthy section on Sunday, he launched a self-examination of the paper regarding race. And the paper published some very ugly excerpts of articles going back 80 or 100 years showing the racist history of the LA Times under the Otis and Chandler families. And today they published a pretty honest report by a guy named Greg Braxton, who was covering the all-white San Fernando Valley and was dispatched in 1992 to cover the riots after the Rodney King beating. About 2 weeks later, he was sent back to Whiteville. And he was deeply offended by this, but he kept it to himself, was kind of sucking it up, and he finally confronted the editor who returned him to the Valley. And that is described in this pretty interesting article published today. Oh, and over the weekend, the state of emergency declared in Portland did not turn into a big emergency as the Proud Boys descended for a rally. And I've seen different accounts, as few as 200 Proud Boys, but according to the Oregonian newspaper from Portland, it was 800 or fewer Proud Boys who showed up. And there were some pushing and shoving and yelling and that sort of thing, but no major incidents occurred. The Kangaroo Court in London, headed by Judge Vanessa Baratzer, who is conducting the hearing into the extradition request from the United States for one Julian Assange, continues, and we continue our coverage. On Friday, as Kevin Gostola reports at Shadowproof, a very strong witness, Patrick Eller, was put on the stand by the defense. And he just shredded the charge and the supporting commentary that Julian Assange illegally tried to assist Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, in his, now her, efforts to hack into certain sectors of the U.S. web. And this guy is a military fellow who, he was a command digital forensic examiner responsible for a team of more than 80 at the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command at Quantico, Virginia. Manning never provided the elements necessary to reconstruct a decryption key for the password, and at the time it would not have been possible to crack an encrypted password hash, such as the one that they're describing. What Manning sent was insufficient to be able to crack the password in the way the government has described. So the charge just falls apart. But Craig Murray, who acknowledged that some of this technical stuff is a little bit beyond him, he focused on the bigger picture. He said Judge Baratzer Friday ruled there be no closing speeches in the Assange hearing. She accepted the proposal initially put forward by the counsel for the U.S. government that closing arguments should simply be submitted in writing without an oral hearing. This was accepted by the defense as they need time to address the new superseding indictment that was dropped just at the end of July, and Baratzer was not willing for oral argument to take place after the 8th of October. So the defense gained a further 3 weeks to put together the closing of their case. But, says Murray, this entire hearing has been conducted in effective secrecy, a comprehensive secrecy that gives sharp insight into the politico-economic structures of current Western society. Physical access to the courtroom's been extremely limited. The corporations that act as internet gatekeepers have heavily suppressed social media posts about Assange, traffic to those few websites which are reporting about it. And he posts a tweet from a Stephen Oldfield who says Kevin Gosztola has reported more on the Assange extradition trial than the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, CNN, MSNBC have combined. And Murray serves up a great quote from Harold Pinter, who he describes as a friend. It never happened. Nothing ever happened. Even while it was happening, it wasn't happening. It didn't matter. It was of no interest. The crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide, while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. So there's more to Murray's report. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. Also, I've linked to the Gosztola report and to today's report of Monday's proceedings, produced by Consortium News and its editor, Joe Laria. Most of today's coverage, which we'll describe in more detail tomorrow, was details about the imprisonment that Assange faces if he is back to the United States. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Over the past week, we've seen an average of 47,000 new cases in the U.S. each day, an average of 866 new deaths, and a hospitalization count of just under 30,000. In New York, Governor Cuomo announced a sharp increase in positive tests, especially for hotspots in Brooklyn and the lower Hudson Valley that have large populations of observant Jews. He suggested that part of the stunning spike could be driven at least in part by the high holidays, which start with Rosh Hashanah and continue with the festival of Sukkot next week. It's Yom Kippur, and we honor that, but whether you're Jewish, Catholic, or Muslim, public health is public health, Cuomo said. He suspects that Labor Day gatherings may have also played a role in this spike. The state recorded an overall 1.5 positive test rate on Sunday, a 50% increase over the previous recent daily rates. And in the top 10 zip codes in the state, the positivity rate was averaging 15%, including 17% in a single zip code in Brooklyn and 30% in a zip code in upstate Spring Valley. So it continues to be a serious issue, even in places where people believe that the big wave of infections has come and gone. The UN Global Preparedness Monitoring Board has released a new report analyzing the pandemic. Here's some quotes. Close to 1 million lives have been lost to COVID-19. The devastating economic and societal impact of COVID-19 reminds us yet again of the centrality of investment in pandemic preparedness for human security and the need to reconsider how national security budgets are spent. The pandemic has revealed a collective failure to take pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response seriously and prioritize it accordingly. It has exploited and exacerbated the fissures within societies and among nations. It has exploited inequalities, reminding us in no uncertain terms that there is no health security without social security. and that's not a retirement plan. In Little Rock, in a Sunday night letter to the school district, a teachers' union warned that teachers would not be returning for in-person classes today. The letter said its members had agreed schools are not safe for in-person instruction and that the risk to our students, our staff members, and community is too great. The union cited unsafe working conditions, said this is not a strike or a work stoppage. We are completely and totally willing to work and serve our students virtually in a manner that keeps everyone safe and alive. Stat News reports that it's obtained an organizational chart showing the scope and structure of Operation Warp Speed. That is the vaccine development program under the Trump administration. This data, July 30th, shows that roughly 60 military officers, including 4 generals, are involved in the leadership of Operation Warp Speed, many of whom have never worked in healthcare or vaccine development before. Gives you a lot of confidence, doesn't it? Oh, yeah. In a comment from a Pentagon spokesperson, the Department of Defense has been clear in its role in Operation Warp Speed. We are providing the bandwidth of logistical expertise, including program management and contracting proficiency, to this all-of-America effort. And Linda adds, anyone who follows reports on DoD contracting abuses would laugh at that statement. One recent report found over 1,000 criminal cases of defense contracting fraud in the 5-year period from 2013 to 17, and another 443 fraud-related civil cases resulting in judgments against 546 defendants. Yeah, we can count on them. There's just no doubt about it. Well, the embattled and discredited head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, who's had to dance to tunes that Trump calls without any practice, he was on a flight, sat next to an NBC News reporter, and in their chit-chat, Redfield criticized Scott Atlas, the guy that Trump imported from Stanford, a radiologist, a Fox News talking head. And Redfield told the NBC guy, everything he says is false. Is there a follow-up quote? No. Oh, here we no. Anyway, it's a shit show. And Redfield is right about Atlas. But Redfield has debased himself and rolled over time and again as the White House has ordered him to doctor reports and massage recommendations and protocols. And there we are. A couple of more before I wrap up here. In Europe, the case-demic that I have commented about and that our friendly listener, Olivier de Merlot, has shared with us, well, the case-demic appears to continue in Britain, where they show 6,000 new coronavirus cases on last Wednesday, the highest since May 1st, but only 134 patients were admitted to hospitals. But in Spain, where new cases have surged to more than 10,000 per day, hospitals in Madrid are close to capacity. The government said it's preparing to reopen field hospitals. And in France, hospitalizations are climbing. But I want to stress that in both countries, Spain and France, fatalities have not recently increased in any substantial way. So on Sunday, there was a big protest at Trafalgar Square in London. People shouted, "No more lies, no more masks, no more lockdowns." We've seen similar protests in Berlin, Brussels, Dublin, and Paris. And clearly, people are chafing at restrictions on their personal freedom and their lives. And I do understand the expression that people are making. But I also think that there are many people who are downplaying the unpredictability of this virus. They take a look at certain statistics and just say, no big deal. It's not going to affect me. And so we have a serious problem developing as many people are checking out on the efforts to restrict the spread of the virus that impose various limits on their behavior. My longtime friend and colleague, Mark Crispin Miller, at New York University, is getting some publicity. He's in hot water with the administration because one of his students tweeted and complained that in a recent class that Mark Crispin Miller, a tenured professor, spent an entire class period telling students that wearing masks doesn't prevent the spread of COVID-19, that hydroxychloroquine trials were made to fail so more people would be given the vaccine and have their DNA changed. Miller cites scientific studies in his argument that masks aren't effective in stopping the spread of flu-like respiratory diseases. This led the administration to the unusual move of an email to all of the students of Mark Crispin Miller. The tenets of academic freedom accord wide latitude to faculty in their scholarship and teaching. NYU has the utmost respect for the principles of academic freedom, and so is naturally circumspect about commenting on views expressed by faculty. Amid reports that your professor, Mark Crispin Miller, has been saying that masks are ineffective in checking the spread of COVID-19, we refer you to the most authoritative public health guidance, which recommends wearing a mask as an effective way to reduce the spread of COVID-19. The evidence backs it up. That's linked to what they consider to be evidence. And we remind you that wearing a mask is required at NYU. It pains us to comment in any way on a faculty member's comments, and we do so advisedly now. However, we do not feel that we have a choice. Now, I defend the academic freedom of Mark Crispin Miller, and I know he deeply believes that mask wearing is counterproductive, that it doesn't prevent the spread, and he is quoted in the article. He called his students' tweets venomous, said he told students to not ignore the state and school mask mandate. He defended the teachings in his mass persuasion and propaganda course and said the worldwide mask wearing is propaganda peddled by the left and mainstream media. He argued that he wants to urge students to think for themselves and study the evidence instead of merely bowing to authority. That's my intellectual and civic obligation as a teacher, whatever NYU's official policy or New York State's. It's one thing to expect the students to obey their institution's rules, but quite another to urge them not to think about it. Well, it's provocative, and it's controversial. Once again, I defend his right to speak and to espouse those views. In general, I don't embrace them. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast all the way to the ending here. You'll find it on YouTube. You'll share it all over the place if you like. And I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.